French President Emmanuel Macron received a grand welcome during his recent visit to China. After his visit, Macron said that Europe should not be a quote-unquote follower of either Washington or Beijing and get caught up in any escalation over Taiwan. He added that Europe should reduce its dependency on America, and these comments have triggered strong reactions from European politicians. Macron has never been shy of making controversial statements, and while the idea that Europe should stand on its own feet has been widely endorsed before, suggestions that they should distance themselves from the US is being termed by some as impractical and unrealistic. Tensions between US and China are still high, and China recently engineered a diplomatic peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This could be seen as a carefully crafted move with the motive to weaken US's influence over the Gulf. And on the other hand, Macron's comments could be seen as China trying to exert its influence over Europe. European officials are hitting back at Macron for his controversial statements now. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who is on a visit to China as we speak, reacted to Macron's statement and said that Europe is united in its policy towards Beijing. She also said that Europe must not turn a blind eye to the tensions between China and Taiwan. She said that a military escalation in the region would be a quote-unquote worst-case scenario for the entire global economy. Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, also hit out at French President Emmanuel Macron. He said that EU is able to speak on foreign and security policy and to determine its own positions. He termed Macron warning Europe against being a vassal for the US as unfortunate. Pistorius said that driving wedges between various European stances only helps Chinese foreign policy in the end. Now, Dutch Prime Minister also said that US is an indispensable ally. He also said that without the US's support, it was inconceivable that Ukraine could have withstood the waves of violence against Russia in the past 1 year. The Polish Prime Minister, who is on a visit to Washington, had slammed EU leaders like Macron for seeking trade contacts with Beijing. He said that their aspirations to sell EU products in China at high geopolitical cost was short-sighted. He said that he does not understand the concept of European strategic autonomy if it meant they were shooting themselves in the knee. Lithuanian Foreign Minister also made scathing attacks on the idea that Europe can persuade Xi Jinping to intercede with Putin and de-escalate the situation in Ukraine. He said that he recognizes the benefits and necessity of transatlantic unity, but he also said that he doesn't suggest begging for dictators to help secure peace in Europe. Reacting to Macron, China, who welcomed the French president with pomp and show, termed his comments as quote-unquote brilliant. Some may say that China is using Macron's stance to drive a wedge between the US and its allies across the Atlantic in Europe. Now for more on this, James Jackson, a journalist and political analyst, is joining us live from Berlin. Welcome to the broadcast, James. It has been a tough week for Macron. He's facing protests at home and from across Europe now. Would you call his trip to China as strategic or ill-timing?
I think it was definitely ill-timing. Maybe it did help to distract from his domestic problems. But even then, I'm not convinced, because it made him... Macron really likes to, and is generally quite successful at presenting himself as an international statesman. He's had maybe more impact on the global scene than he has at home, where he is less popular despite winning re-election. But I think Macron has shot himself, and maybe even shot strategic autonomy in the foot with his visit to China, because I think he wanted to kind of do a Nixon visits China, cool the tension strategy, which would make sense if it wasn't for the context, very vital context, of China supporting Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So with this, a very vital context. I think he looks like he's undermining Ukrainian efforts to fight for freedom and to fight for peace, as well as questioning US support for Europe, when actually Europe has never been more dependent on US within my lifetime, at least. So strategic autonomy is one of those ideas that sounds good, but you have to do a lot to get ready to prepare that. And I haven't seen that from Macron or from Scholz.
All right, very interesting take. Now, you know, the reactions within European political circles have been sharply divided. But if I don't talk about the present and I talk about the future, how do you see it? Should Europe align itself with the changing world order or stick to its traditional diplomacy?
So the divide within Europe right now is actually a geographical one. So in the East, you have a strip of countries that have had experience of either Russia or the Soviet Union, and they know that they need the US because they have, for security guarantees, for democracy promotion, for other things. And that's not an easy thing to say, because the US, of course, has its flaws, and it looks after its own interests in many regions, sometimes violently, as we saw in Iraq, and makes mistakes as well. But what the Eastern and Central European countries have seen, and I've spoken with a number of senior diplomatic figures in those countries in recent months, what they've seen is that the US is the one who stands by them when they're faced with Russian aggression, whereas Macron and Scholz, or German and French attempts to create European autonomy, often means making deals with Russia, which undermine Eastern Europe's security. So Ukraine would be the best example of that. Of course, Merkel in 2008 in Bucharest blocked Ukraine's entry into NATO. There's the cases of Germans buying Russian gas and the Nord Stream pipeline against the protests. So what should Europe do? I think that now is definitely not the time to create strategic autonomy. I think it's a good idea, because Europe can fight for its values. It can then define its own policies. But actually, I don't think that going to China and calling up Putin, as Macron has done many times, is the way to do that, nor as Scholz did. And I personally think this was the nail in the coffin for European strategic autonomy for the next 10 years, saying that they would only deliver Panzers, Leopard tanks to Ukraine if the US gave some Abrams. That, to me, doesn't seem... That's shows that we are still dependent on US security. They've tacitly admitted it, but then they want to exaggerate their own importance.
All right. Thank you for all those insights, James. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks for having me.